I grew up hearing that the most dangerous man isn't the one with the biggest army, the sharpest sword, or the most terrifying war cry. It's the man with nothing to lose. Because when someone has nothing left to fear, they become unpredictable, relentless, and willing to take risks that no rational person would dare to consider. And if that's true, then Spartacus might just be the most dangerous man in history. A slave turned gladiator turned rebel leader. He didn't just resist oppression, he waged an all-out war against it. He took on the Roman Empire itself. Not with legions of trained soldiers, not with political maneuvering, not even with outside allies, but with a ragtag army of escaped slaves, disgruntled peasants, and those the world had long since given up on. And for a moment, just a brief, shining moment, it looked like he might actually win. But Rome doesn't forgive. Rome doesn't forget. And Rome absolutely does not tolerate defiance. To challenge the might of Rome was to court disaster. To defy Rome as a gladiator turned rebel was nothing short of madness. And yet, Spartacus did it anyway. Not because he had some grand delusion of replacing the empire with a utopia. Not because he wanted to carve out a throne for himself. But because he was done being a pawn in someone else's game. He was done fighting for the amusement of corrupt senators and sadistic elites. He was done accepting that his life was worth less than the coins exchanged in a betting pit. And so, he fought back. How did a mere gladiator, a man with no royal blood, no political power, and no formal military training, manage to send the greatest empire on earth into a full-blown panic? How did he turn an escape plan into a full-scale rebellion that would shake Rome to its core? And why, even after his brutal death, does his name still inspire revolutionaries, rebels, and dreamers centuries later? This is the story of the man who dared to defy an empire. Our story starts somewhere in the Balkans, in what is now modern-day Bulgaria. Spartacus was likely born into the Thracian warrior culture, a people known for their love of battle, booze, and making the Romans' lives miserable. They were fierce, independent, and notoriously difficult to conquer. Thracians weren't just warriors. They were survivors, hardened by the rugged terrain and the endless conflicts that came with living in a region that both Greece and Rome wanted to control. It's safe to say that Spartacus didn't grow up soft. While details about his early life remain murky, most historians agree that he was probably a soldier at some point. Some say he fought for Rome, possibly as an auxiliary in the legions, before things took a dark turn. Maybe he deserted. Maybe he refused an order. Maybe he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whatever the reason, he found himself betrayed, captured, and sold into slavery. Classic Roman move. Now, being a Roman slave was already a waking nightmare. Rome didn't see slaves as people, they were property, tools to be used and discarded at will. And in a world where slaves were forced into grueling labor, brutal punishments, and lives that barely qualified as existence, Spartacus drew an even worse fate. The gladiator pits. He was sent to a gladiator school in Capua, a city known for its thriving blood sport industry. His owner? A man named Lentulus Batiatus, whose entire business model revolved around turning men into weapons, training them to entertain the bloodthirsty Roman crowd in the most gruesome ways imaginable. Gladiators weren't just fighters, they were commodities, designed to die spectacularly for the amusement of an audience that craved violence the way modern crowds crave halftime shows. But don't be fooled by the Hollywood image of gladiators as celebrated warriors. Sure, the best of them could achieve fame, and some even won their freedom. But for most, the reality was far bleaker. Gladiator life wasn't much better than regular slavery. The only real difference, you got fed better. And that wasn't because the Romans were generous. It was because they needed their entertainment, lasting longer than 5 minutes. Training was relentless, designed to push men to their absolute limits. The fights were often rigged, ensuring that the house always won. And the retirement plan, well, unless you were one of the rare few to win your freedom, it was a one-way ticket to an unmarked grave. For most, there was no escape, no way out, no hope. But Spartacus wasn't most men. He wasn't content to be another pawn in Rome's sadistic game. He saw the system for what it was, a machine built to grind people down and spit them out. And he knew that as long as he played by their rules, he would never be anything more than a tool for their amusement. So he started making allies, whispering about escape, planting the seeds of something far greater than just survival. By 73 BCE, the whispers had turned into plans. And when the moment came, when the chance for freedom presented itself, Spartacus and about 70 other gladiators didn't hesitate. They armed themselves with whatever they could get their hands on. Kitchen knives, makeshift clubs, anything sharp enough to cut flesh. And then, In a furious explosion of desperation and rage, they slaughtered their guards, broke out of the Gladiator school, and disappeared into the night. They didn't just escape. They ignited a fire that would consume Rome in chaos, with nothing but kitchen knives, stolen cleavers, and the kind of desperation that makes men unstoppable. Spartacus and his fellow gladiators turned their prison into a battleground. They didn't just fight to escape, they fought like men who had nothing to lose. Like men who had been trained to kill for the amusement of their captors, and had finally been given a chance to turn the tables. The guards, armed and confident in their authority, never stood a chance. Within minutes, the hallways were slick with blood, the air thick with the sounds of battle, steel clashing, screams echoing, bodies thudding on cold stone. But escape was only the first step. Spartacus knew that killing a few guards wouldn't be enough to secure their freedom. Rome was relentless, and if they were caught, their punishment would make their past suffering look like a minor inconvenience. They needed to disappear, regroup, and figure out what came next. So they ran out of the Gladiator school, through the streets of Capua, stealing weapons, food, anything that could aid their survival. And when they had what they needed, they headed for the one place where they had a chance to hold their ground, Mount Vesuvius. To the Romans, Vesuvius was just another mountain, but to Spartacus, it was a fortress. Its steep slopes made it nearly impossible to attack directly. Its caves and rugged terrain provided shelter, and its high vantage points allowed his men to spot enemy movements long before they arrived. More importantly, he gave them time. Time to rest, time to train, and time to prepare for the inevitable Roman response. At first, Rome didn't take them seriously. Runaway slaves were a common problem, and no one in the Senate was losing sleep over a few dozen fugitives hiding in the hills. So they sent a small militia, lightly armed force tasked with rounding up the escapees. Like stray cattle, they marched toward Vesuvius, with the confidence of men who had never known fear. They never made it back. Spartacus didn't just defeat the Romans, he humiliated them. He knew they would approach from the obvious routes, so he and his men scaled the cliffs, using vines to lower themselves down behind enemy lines. Then, like a thunderstorm breaking over the battlefield, they struck. The Romans, expecting a frontal assault, found themselves surrounded, their carefully planned formation crumbling into chaos. The slaves fought like men possessed, fueled by the raw, unrelenting rage of years spent in chains. It was a massacre. The survivors, if they could even be called that, stumbled back to Rome, battered and broken, with a single, terrifying message. Spartacus was more than a problem. He was a disaster waiting to happen. And Rome's worst nightmare was about to come true. Word spread like wildfire. Slaves across Italy heard the impossible. One of their own had defied Rome and lived to tell the tale. And he wasn't just running, he was winning. One by one, they broke their chains, overpowered their masters, and fled to join him. What started as a handful of escaped gladiators turned into an army. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became tens of thousands. But this was no ordinary mob. Spartacus wasn't just a leader, he was a tactician. A warrior who understood that rage alone wouldn't win a war. He trained his men, teaching them discipline, formations, and strategy. He turned farmers into soldiers, slaves into warriors, outcasts into an unstoppable force. And Rome, for the first time, began to realize just how much trouble they were in. What made Spartacus so dangerous wasn't just his ability to fight, it was his ability to adapt. He studied Roman tactics and twisted them against their own legions. He avoided direct confrontations when he could, choosing instead to strike fast and disappear before the enemy could regroup. He ambushed convoys, cut supply lines, and used every advantage the terrain gave him. The Romans expected a desperate, unorganized rebellion. What they got was a war machine. Then came the real test. Rome, realizing their mistake, sent a real army this time. A force meant to crush Spartacus once and for all, but they underestimated him again. In battle after battle, he outmaneuvered them, outhought them, and outfought them. He turned their discipline against them, forcing them into unfamiliar, brutal guerrilla warfare where their rigid formations meant nothing. He made them bleed. He made them afraid. And then, he did the unthinkable. He marched north. Rome had assumed he was just another rebel looking to plunder and burn. A savage who would be satisfied with raiding a few towns before being crushed under the might of the legions. But Spartacus had bigger plans. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He was here to end it. His army reached the Alps, the gateway to freedom. If they crossed, they would be beyond Rome's reach. They could disappear, scatter into the lands beyond, and live free. But they didn't cross. Why? That's the question that has haunted historians for centuries. Some say his men refused to leave. After years of revenge and bloodshed, they weren't willing to walk away without finishing the fight. Others believe Spartacus himself had changed. Maybe he no longer wanted to run. Maybe, just maybe, he thought they could win. Whatever the reason, the moment they turned back south, their fate was sealed. Rome had finally woken up to the threat, and they weren't about to let this rebellion continue. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome, a man with everything to prove and the resources to make it happen. Unlike the generals before him, Crassus understood that Spartacus couldn't be beaten with brute force alone. So he played the long game. He cut off supply lines, built massive fortifications to trap the rebels in the south, and used hunger as a weapon. He was patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless. Spartacus, knowing there was no escape, made one last desperate gamble. He led his army into a final all-or-nothing battle against Crassus. His men fought like demons, tearing through Roman lines with the kind of fury that comes only from those who know there is no tomorrow. The battlefield became a graveyard, a sea of bodies where the last echoes of the rebellion were drowned in blood. Spartacus himself was never found. Maybe he died fighting, cut down in the chaos. Maybe he was buried beneath the fallen. Maybe, just maybe, he escaped, vanishing into legend. But Rome made sure his rebellion ended in the most brutal way possible. Crassus didn't just defeat Spartacus, he made an example out of him. 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, Rome's main highway, their bodies left to rot under the scorching sun and the watchful eyes of every traveler passing by. The rebels didn't get graves. They didn't get last rites. They weren't given the dignity of a quick death. Instead, they hung there for days, some clinging to life longer than they should have, writhing in agony as birds pecked at their flesh, as the stench of decay filled the air. Every Roman citizen, every merchant, every soldier who walked that road saw them and knew exactly what awaited those who dared to challenge the empire. One of history's most chilling mass executions. It was a message, carved into flesh and bone, screaming one thing: this is what happens when you defy Rome. And yet, Rome could never erase him. His name survived, whispered among those who still longed for justice. He became more than a man. He became a symbol, a legend, an eternal reminder that even the greatest empire on earth could be shaken by one man with nothing to lose. His story spread beyond the empire, beyond his own time, fueling the dreams of the oppressed for centuries. To Rome, he was a criminal, a renegade, a dangerous outlaw who got what he deserved. But to others, he was something far greater. He was the ultimate underdog, the man who stood against impossible odds, and almost won. He wasn't born into power. He didn't have wealth, noble blood, or even an army when he started. He had nothing but his mind, his will, and the unshakable belief that he was not meant to be owned. And here's the thing. His rebellion exposed the cracks in Rome's seemingly invincible empire. Rome won the battle, but they barely survived the war. The fact that a slave army, made up of former gladiators, farmers, and outcasts, could go toe-to-toe with the most powerful military in the world was an embarrassment the Romans could never fully erase. Even after Spartacus was gone, Rome became more paranoid, more brutal, more oppressive. And history has shown us that when a government starts cracking down harder, when they rule through fear rather than respect, their days are numbered. Those cracks that Spartacus carved into Rome's foundation, they took time, but they eventually brought the whole empire down. Because Spartacus wasn't just one man. He was an idea, and ideas can't be crucified. The legacy of Spartacus today. Spartacus is a symbol of resistance, of fighting against tyranny, of refusing to accept the chains the world tries to put on you. His name has been invoked by revolutionaries, civil rights leaders, and rebels across history, from slave uprisings in later centuries to modern freedom movements. The spirit of Spartacus lives on. He represents that moment when enough is enough. When a person decides they will no longer bow, no longer kneel, no longer suffer in silence. Whether you see him as a hero, a tragic figure, or just an angry guy who got fed up with his circumstances, his story is proof of one undeniable truth. Empires rise, empires fall, but the human desire for freedom, that never dies. Spartacus's story has been told and retold, from ancient Roman accounts to Hollywood epics, but no matter how many times it's adapted, one thing remains the same. His fight was never just about escaping slavery. It was about proving that no system, no empire, no power is untouchable. And if history has taught us anything, It's that even the mightiest rulers should be afraid of the people they think they own. So, what do you think? Was Spartacus just a lucky rebel who got in over his head? Or was he one of history's greatest revolutionaries? Did he truly believe he could take down Rome? Or was it all just about survival? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your take. And if you love stories of history's most daring figures, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because here on Event, we don't just talk about history, we share stories shaped by time. See you in the next one.